In the autumn of 1844, 14-year-old Thomas Whitmore discovered something that would shatter his understanding of the world forever. While organizing student records in the basement office of Blackwood Academy for young gentlemen in Hartford, Connecticut, the boy noticed an alarming pattern that defied all logic. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. According to the school's enrollment ledgers, 67 students had been admitted over the past 2 years. Yet only 31 boys remained at the academy. 36 young men had simply vanished without explanation, their tuition mysteriously continuing to arrive from distant families who believed their sons were thriving in their studies. For months, the faculty and staff of Blackwood Academy had explained these disappearances as voluntary departures. Students who had grown homesick and returned to their families. Boys who had been expelled for poor behavior. Young men who had chosen to pursue other educational opportunities. But Thomas had been keeping his own careful count, and the numbers told a different, far more sinister story. The nightmare began for Thomas Whitmore on a crisp October morning when he first stumbled upon the discrepancy that would consume his thoughts and endanger his life for weeks to come. Blackwood Academy stood like a Gothic fortress on the outskirts of Hartford, its imposing brick walls and tall, narrow windows creating an atmosphere of scholarly isolation that parents found reassuring and students found oppressive. The academy had been established in 1842 by the Blackwood family, who had presented themselves to Connecticut society as devoted educators, committed to molding young men of character and distinction. Cornelius Blackwood served as headmaster, a tall, austere man with penetrating gray eyes and a voice that commanded immediate respect. His wife, Millicent, managed the domestic affairs of the school with an efficiency that bordered on military precision. Their adult son, Edmund, taught mathematics and natural philosophy, while their daughter, Constance, served as the academy's music instructor and social graces coordinator. To the wealthy families of New England who sent their sons to Blackwood Academy, the institution represented everything they desired in an educational establishment. The curriculum was rigorous, emphasizing classical languages, literature, mathematics, and moral instruction. The facilities were modern and well-maintained, with spacious dormitories, a well-stocked library, and grounds that provided ample space for physical exercise and contemplation. Thomas Whitmore had arrived at Blackwood Academy 6 months earlier, sent by his merchant father who believed that a proper boarding school education would prepare the boy for a successful career in business. Thomas came from a middle-class family in Boston whose recent prosperity had afforded them the luxury of sending their eldest son away to school. Unlike many of his classmates who came from established wealthy families, Thomas approached his education with genuine enthusiasm and a natural curiosity that set him apart from his peers. The boy's methodical nature and attention to detail had quickly earned him the trust of the academy's staff. When the school's secretary had fallen ill with consumption, Thomas had volunteered to help maintain the enrollment records and correspondence files. It was mundane work that most students would have found tedious, but Thomas appreciated the orderly nature of record-keeping and took pride in ensuring that every document was properly filed and every entry was accurate. What made Thomas particularly suited for this administrative role was his genuine concern for his fellow students. Unlike many boarding school environments where competition and social hierarchy created divisions among the boys, Thomas had made an effort to befriend students from all backgrounds and academic levels. He knew the names and personal stories of nearly every boy at the academy, from the brilliant scholarship students to the struggling sons of wealthy families who had been sent away more for discipline than education. This personal knowledge of his classmates was what first alerted Thomas to the troubling pattern of disappearances. There was Marcus Hartwell, The quiet boy from Providence, whose passion for astronomy had led him to spend hours studying the night sky from the Academy's tower. Marcus had been planning to write a detailed paper on celestial navigation when he had supposedly received urgent word that his grandmother was dying and had left immediately for home. There was Jonathan Pike, the red-haired son of a Vermont timber merchant who had struggled academically but had found success in the Academy's woodworking shop. Jonathan had been crafting an intricate music box as a Christmas gift for his younger sister when he had allegedly been expelled fighting with another student. Yet Thomas had never witnessed any such altercation, and Jonathan had always been one of the most peaceable boys at the school. Most puzzling of all was the case of William Chun, the brilliant son of a Chinese merchant family who had immigrated to Boston. William had been the Academy's top student in mathematics and had been corresponding regularly with professors at Hartford College about the possibility of early admission. His sudden departure, explained as a family decision to return to China, seemed completely inconsistent with everything Thomas knew about William's academic ambitions and his family's commitment to American education. Each disappearance had been accompanied by official explanations that seemed plausible on the surface, but felt wrong to anyone who had actually known the missing students. Parents received carefully crafted letters explaining their sons' departures, letters that contained just enough personal details to seem authentic while avoiding any information that might prompt uncomfortable questions. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Thomas's suspicions first crystallized on a foggy Thursday evening in late October when he was working late in the basement office, trying to reconcile the enrollment records with the Academy's financial accounts. The building was quiet except for the distant sound of students preparing for evening prayers in the chapel above. As Thomas compared the tuition payment records with the list of current students, the mathematical impossibility of the situation became undeniable. The Academy was continuing to receive full tuition payments for students who were no longer in attendance. More disturbing still, these payments were being deposited into the school's accounts without any notation that the students had withdrawn or been expelled. According to the financial records, Blackwood Academy was educating 67 students and being paid accordingly, despite housing fewer than half that number. As Thomas sat in the flickering candlelight, surrounded by ledgers and correspondence files, the terrible arithmetic began to form a picture that made his stomach churn with fear. Either the Blackwood family was engaged in systematic fraud, continuing to collect tuition for students who had left the Academy, or something far worse was happening to the missing boys. The sound of footsteps in the corridor above interrupted Thomas's calculations. Heavy, deliberate steps that belonged to someone moving through the building with purpose rather than the casual wandering of a student or staff member. Thomas quickly closed the ledgers and extinguished his candle, sitting in darkness as the footsteps paused directly above his location. Through the thin wooden ceiling, he could hear muffled voices engaged in urgent conversation. The words were indistinct, but the tone suggested secrecy and concern. Thomas pressed his ear to the ceiling, straining to make out what was being discussed, but the old building's construction made eavesdropping impossible. When the voices finally faded and the footsteps moved away, Thomas remained in darkness. For several more minutes, his mind racing with possibilities. His discovery of the enrollment discrepancy could be explained by simple accounting errors or administrative incompetence. But the late-night conversations and secretive behavior suggested something more deliberate and sinister. As Thomas finally made his way back to his dormitory, moving carefully through the darkened corridors of Blackwood Academy, he realized that his innocent desire to help with administrative tasks had led him to uncover something that powerful people wanted to keep hidden. The missing students weren't just statistics in a ledger. They were boys he had known and cared about, boys whose disappearances deserved explanation and whose families deserved the truth. but in the isolated world of Blackwood Academy, where the Blackwood family controlled every aspect of daily life and maintained absolute authority over their students, Thomas faced a terrifying question. If his suspicions were correct, and if the missing students hadn't simply left the academy voluntarily, then what had really happened to them? And more importantly, what would happen to him if the Blackwood family discovered that he was asking these dangerous questions? The 14-year-old boy lay awake in his narrow dormitory bed that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the quiet breathing of his sleeping roommates. Somewhere in the darkness of Blackwood Academy, terrible secrets were being kept, and Thomas Whitmore had stumbled upon evidence that could expose them. But he was just one boy in an institution controlled by people who would stop at nothing to protect their carefully constructed facade of respectability and educational excellence. Thomas's investigation began in earnest the following morning. During breakfast in the Academy's grand dining hall, the vast room, with its high-vaulted ceiling and tall windows that let in the pale autumn light, normally buzzed with the conversation of dozens of young men. But as Thomas sat at his usual table, carefully observing his fellow students, he noticed something that had escaped his attention before. The dining hall, which had been designed to accommodate nearly 100 students, felt strangely empty. The realization struck him with sudden clarity as he counted the occupied tables. When he had first arrived at Blackwood Academy 6 months earlier, every table had been full, with students sometimes sharing seats or standing along the walls during particularly crowded meals. Now barely half the tables were occupied, and those that were seated, students seemed to cluster together as if seeking comfort in smaller groups. Thomas began to pay closer attention to the conversations around him, listening for any mention of the missing students. What he discovered was even more disturbing than the silence. When boys did speak of their departed classmates, they spoke in hushed, uncertain tones that suggested fear rather than the normal sadness of separated friends. At the table nearest to his own, 2 younger students were discussing Marcus Hartwell's sudden departure. One boy, a pale 13-year-old named David Richardson, was insisting that Marcus had seemed perfectly happy the day before his alleged family emergency. The other student, Peter Aldrich, quickly shushed his companion and glanced nervously toward the faculty table where the Blackwood family sat in stern supervision of the morning meal. Thomas noticed that such conversations invariably ended when any member of the Blackwood family drew near. Students who had been talking animatedly would fall silent, their eyes focused intently on their plates as if afraid to meet the gaze of their instructors. This pattern of fearful silence extended beyond casual conversation. During academic lessons, students who had once been eager to participate now answered questions with obvious reluctance, and the classroom discussions that had once been lively exchanges of ideas had become stilted recitations of approved responses. The first concrete evidence of something truly sinister came during Thomas's weekly visit to the Academy's laundry facility. As part of his administrative duties, he was responsible for ensuring that the inventory of student clothing and personal items remained accurate. The laundry was located in the basement of the main building, a cramped, humid space filled with large wooden wash basins and drying lines that created a maze of hanging garments. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who managed the laundry operations, had worked at the academy since its founding and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of every student's belongings. She was a small, energetic woman whose Irish accent had softened but never disappeared during her decades in America. Unlike the faculty members who maintained formal distance from the students, Mrs. Henderson treated the boys with maternal warmth that made her a confidant for homesick students and a source of practical wisdom for those struggling with the challenges of boarding school life. When Thomas approached her with questions about the clothing and personal effects of the missing students, Mrs. Henderson's usual cheerful demeanor immediately darkened. She glanced around the empty laundry room nervously before speaking in a voice barely above a whisper. "Those boys," she said, her weathered hands wringing a damp shirt with unnecessary force. "They left everything behind." "Everything, Thomas. Their finest clothes, their books, their letters from home. In all my years working in schools, I've never seen boys leave without taking their personal treasures." She led Thomas to a storage room behind the main laundry area, a dusty space filled with trunks and wooden crates. Inside these containers were the accumulated belongings of the missing students, items that painted a picture of young men who had expected to return to their rooms. Marcus Hartwell's prized telescope sat carefully wrapped in cloth, alongside his collection of star charts and astronomical calculations. Jonathan Pike's woodworking tools were neatly arranged in their custom-made case, and his unfinished music box sat precisely as he had left it, with tiny gears and springs organized for the next day's work. Most heartbreaking of all were William Chun's possessions. His mathematics notebooks contained detailed calculations and theoretical proofs that represented months of advanced study. His correspondence with Harvard professors was carefully filed and organized, including a letter dated just 3 days before his supposed departure that discussed his application for early admission and expressed excitement about his academic future. Mrs. Henderson picked up a small wooden box from William's collection, opening it to reveal a delicate jade pendant carved in the shape of a dragon. "His grandmother's gift," she explained, her voice thick with emotion. "He told me it was the most precious thing he owned, brought all the way from China. Said it would protect him from harm and bring good fortune to his studies. What boy leaves such a treasure behind when going home to his family?" As Thomas examined the abandoned belongings, Mrs. Henderson continued her revelations in hushed, frightened tones. She had tried to ask the Blackwood family about the proper procedure for returning these items to the missing students' families, but her inquiries had been met with sharp rebukes and warnings not to concern herself with matters beyond her responsibilities. "Mr. Edmund told me to dispose of everything," she whispered. "Said the boys had forfeited their belongings by leaving without proper notice. But I couldn't bring myself to throw away these precious things. I've been hiding them, hoping someone would come asking the right questions." The elderly woman's courage in preserving this evidence impressed Thomas, but it also revealed the dangerous position they both occupied. If the Blackwood family was willing to discard all traces of the missing student's existence, they were clearly committed to maintaining whatever deception they had constructed. Mrs. Henderson's refusal to follow orders made her a potential liability, and Thomas realized that his own investigation might be putting her at risk. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the basement stairs. Mrs. Henderson quickly closed the storage room door and began hanging laundry with exaggerated focus, while Thomas pretended to examine the inventory ledger. The footsteps belonged to Edmund Blackwood, whose tall, angular frame appeared in the doorway like a specter materializing from the shadows. Edmund was perhaps the most unsettling member of the Blackwood family. Unlike his father's commanding authority or his mother's efficient coldness, Edmund possessed a nervous energy that made him seem constantly agitated and suspicious. His dark eyes moved restlessly around any room he entered, as if searching for threats or secrets that might be hidden from his view. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, his voice carrying the artificial politeness that barely concealed irritation, "I trust you're not allowing students to interfere with your work duties. Young Whitmore, you should be attending to your own responsibilities rather than socializing in the laundry facility." Thomas felt his heart racing as Edmund's gaze fixed upon him with uncomfortable intensity. There was something predatory in the man's stare, a quality that suggested he was evaluating Thomas not as a student to be educated, but as a potential problem to be solved. "I was simply updating the clothing inventory, sir," Thomas replied, proud that his voice remained steady despite his fear. Mrs. Henderson was helping me identify items that might need repair or replacement. Edmund's smile was cold and calculating. "How conscientious of you, Thomas. Though I must remind you that some aspects of academy operations are beyond the scope of student involvement. Perhaps it would be better if you focused your administrative efforts on matters more appropriate to your age and position." The warning was clear, though couched in the language of academic guidance. Thomas was being told to stay away from areas that might reveal uncomfortable truths about the academy's operations. As Edmund's footsteps faded back up the basement stairs, Mrs. Henderson and Thomas exchanged a look that confirmed their mutual understanding of the danger they faced. That evening, Thomas made a decision that would change the course of his investigation and dramatically increase the risk to his safety. Rather than retreating from his inquiries, as Edmund had suggested, he chose to expand them. If the Blackwood family was indeed responsible for the disappearance of his fellow students, then someone needed to document the evidence before it could be destroyed or hidden. Using his access to the Academy's administrative offices, Thomas began a systematic review of all correspondence related to the missing students. Working by candlelight in the hours after evening prayers, when the building was supposed to be empty of student activity, he carefully examined every letter, invoice, and official document that mentioned the departed boys. What he discovered was a sophisticated pattern of deception that revealed careful planning and coordination among the Blackwood family members. Each student's departure had been preceded by a series of forged communications designed to create a plausible narrative for their absence. Letters supposedly written by the students to their families contained subtle inconsistencies in handwriting and vocabulary that suggested they had been composed by someone else. More damning still were the financial records that showed tuition payments continuing to arrive for students who were no longer in attendance. These payments were being deposited into special accounts that Thomas had not previously noticed, accounts that seemed to exist separately from the Academy's normal operating expenses. The most disturbing evidence came in the form of correspondence between Cornelius Blackwood and various business associates in Hartford and New York. These letters, written in carefully coded language, discussed inventory management and product disposal in terms that made no sense in the context of educational administration. References to problematic units and permanent solutions suggested a commercial operation that had nothing to do with teaching young men. As Thomas pieced together this documentary evidence, a horrifying picture began to emerge. Blackwood Academy was not simply an educational institution that had experienced an unusual number of student departures. It was a carefully constructed trap designed to identify, isolate, and eliminate young men whose deaths would not be immediately investigated or questioned. The missing students shared several crucial characteristics that made them ideal victims. They came from families that were geographically distant from Connecticut, reducing the likelihood of unexpected visits or close monitoring of their progress. They were often eldest sons or only children whose deaths would eliminate potential heirs to substantial family fortunes. Most importantly, they were students whose academic or social difficulties made them seem like plausible candidates for disciplinary action or voluntary departure. Thomas's blood ran cold as he realized that his own circumstances fit this profile perfectly. He was far from his family in Boston. His father's recent business success had made him a potentially valuable target, and his administrative work had given him access to information that the Blackwood family clearly wanted to keep secret. The boy's investigation was interrupted by a sound that made his heart stop with terror. Footsteps were moving through the corridor outside the administrative office, slow and deliberate steps that suggested someone was conducting a careful search of the building. Thomas quickly extinguished his candle and gathered the documents he had been examining, stuffing them inside his shirt as he had seen characters do in adventure novels. The footsteps paused directly outside the office door, and Thomas could see a faint line of light beneath the wooden threshold. Someone was standing in the hallway with a lantern, listening for any sound that might indicate unauthorized activity within the administrative offices. Thomas pressed himself against the wall behind a large filing cabinet, hardly daring to breathe as the door handle turned slowly. The door opened with a soft creak, and lamplight spilled into the room as a dark figure entered. Through a gap between the filing cabinets, Thomas could see Constance Blackwood moving through the office with practiced efficiency, checking desks and examining papers with the thoroughness of someone conducting a security inspection. Constance was perhaps the most enigmatic member of the Blackwood family. Younger than Edmund, but possessing a cold intelligence that seemed far beyond her years, she served as the Academy's music instructor while also functioning as what Thomas now realized was an internal security officer. Her musical lessons had always been marked by an uncomfortable intimacy, as if she was studying her students for purposes that had nothing to do with their artistic development. As Constance moved through the office, Thomas noticed that she was not simply conducting a random inspection. She was specifically checking areas where documents might be hidden, examining filing cabinets and desk drawers with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for. When she reached the area where Thomas had been working, she paused and examined the papers on the desk with particular attention. Thomas realized with growing horror that Constance had noticed the displacement of documents that he had thought he had carefully concealed. His investigation had left traces that someone with knowledge of the office's normal organization could easily detect. As Constance straightened papers and reorganized files, she was simultaneously erasing evidence of unauthorized access, while confirming that someone had been conducting investigations into Academy business. When Constance finally left the office, closing the door behind her with deliberate quiet, Thomas remained hidden behind the filing cabinet for nearly an hour. His mind raced with the implications of what he had witnessed. The Blackwood family was not only aware that someone was investigating the missing students, they were actively monitoring their administrative offices to identify potential security breaches. Thomas's investigation had moved beyond simple curiosity about enrollment discrepancies. He was now engaged in a dangerous game of cat and mouse with people who had demonstrated their willingness to make inconvenient individuals disappear permanently. As he finally crept back to his dormitory through the darkened corridors of Blackwood Academy, Thomas realized that his life depended on maintaining the facade of an obedient student, while secretly gathering evidence that could expose the truth about the missing boys. But the most terrifying realization was yet to come. As Thomas slipped into his dormitory bed, he discovered a folded piece of paper tucked beneath his pillow, written in elegant script that he recognized as Constance Blackwood's handwriting. The message was brief but unmistakably threatening. Curiosity can be a dangerous trait in young men. Some questions are better left unasked, and some doors are better left unopened. Sleep well, Thomas. The message confirmed his worst fears. The Blackwood family knew about his investigation, and they were giving him one final warning before taking more decisive action. Thomas lay awake in the darkness, listening to the quiet breathing of his sleeping roommates and wondering how many of them might be gone before the month was over. His methodical investigation had uncovered evidence of systematic murder, but it had also marked him as the next potential victim in a conspiracy that had already claimed the lives of more than 30 young men. The threatening note beneath Thomas's pillow transformed his investigation from academic curiosity into a desperate fight for survival. Over the next several days, he noticed subtle but unmistakable changes in how the Blackwood family and Academy staff treated him. During meals, Cornelius Blackwood's piercing gray eyes seemed to follow his every movement, while Millicent's usual efficient management of domestic affairs now included frequent appearances in areas where Thomas happened to be working. Most unsettling of all was Edmund's newfound interest in Thomas's academic progress. The mathematics instructor began calling on him more frequently during lessons, asking complex questions that seemed designed to test not his mathematical knowledge, but his ability to remain calm under pressure. These interactions felt less like educational exchanges, and more like psychological evaluations, as if Edmund was studying Thomas's responses for signs of guilt or deception. Thomas quickly realized that his administrative duties, which had previously provided him with access to sensitive information, were being gradually curtailed. New restrictions appeared seemingly overnight, limiting student access to certain areas of the academy and requiring faculty supervision for tasks that had previously been performed independently. The message was clear: his movements were being monitored and controlled. The full scope of the Blackwood family's operation began to reveal itself through a discovery that Thomas made during what he thought would be his final opportunity to examine academy records. While organizing files in the headmaster's office during the lunch hour, when the building was supposedly empty except for kitchen staff, Thomas noticed something peculiar about the construction of Cornelius Blackwood's massive oak desk. The desk appeared to have more depth than its visible drawers would suggest, prompting Thomas to examine its structure more carefully. His methodical exploration revealed a hidden compartment concealed behind a false back panel, a secret space that contained documents far more damaging than anything he had previously discovered. The hidden files revealed that Blackwood Academy was not an isolated criminal enterprise, but rather one component of a sophisticated network that extended throughout New England and beyond. Correspondence with associates in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and even London showed that the Blackwood family was part of an organized syndicate that operated multiple institutions under various guises. Some of these establishments presented themselves as boarding schools, while others functioned as orphanages, private hospitals, or charitable institutions for wayward youth. All shared the same fundamental purpose: identifying and eliminating young people whose deaths would provide financial benefits to the syndicate members, while attracting minimal investigation from authorities. The scope of this operation was breathtaking in its ambition and horrifying in its efficiency. According to the documents Thomas discovered, the syndicate had been responsible for hundreds of deaths over the past decade, carefully selecting victims from wealthy families and using their institutional facades to provide plausible explanations for the disappearances. The financial mechanisms underlying this conspiracy were equally sophisticated. The syndicate maintained relationships with corrupt lawyers, estate administrators, and financial institutions that facilitated the transfer of inheritances and family wealth. When a young heir died under suspicious circumstances, syndicate associates would ensure that legal proceedings moved quickly and quietly, often with substantial portions of the deceased's inheritance finding its way into syndicate accounts. Thomas discovered detailed profiles of current Blackwood Academy students that revealed the careful selection criteria used to identify potential victims. Each file contained not only academic and behavioral assessments, but also comprehensive analyses of family wealth, inheritance patterns, and the likelihood that a student's death would trigger intensive investigation. His own file was among those Thomas found, and reading it filled him with terror that made his hands shake as he held the document. The assessment described him as an ideal candidate for processing, noting his family's recent financial success, his status as an eldest son, and his geographical distance from supportive relatives. Most chilling of all was a handwritten notation in Cornelius Blackwood's distinctive script: intelligent but curious. Requires careful handling. Priority target for December processing. The term processing appeared throughout the hidden documents, used as a euphemism for the systematic murder of selected students. Thomas learned that the academy typically processed 3 to 5 students each academic term, spacing the deaths carefully to avoid creating suspicious patterns while maintaining steady revenue from continuing tuition payments. The methods used for processing varied depending on the circumstances and the desired appearance of death. Some students were killed outright and their bodies disposed of in ways that prevented discovery, while others were subjected to gradual poisoning that created the appearance of wasting illness. Still others were staged to look like accidents or suicides, with the Blackwood family providing sorrowful testimony about the deceased student's emotional struggles or reckless behavior. Thomas realized with mounting horror that he had witnessed the early stages of processing without understanding what he was observing. Marcus Hartwell's sudden departure had likely been preceded by his actual murder, with the family emergency story serving as cover for his disappearance. Jonathan Pike's alleged expulsion had probably followed his death by violence, while William Chun's supposed return to China had masked his elimination and the theft of his academic achievements. The documents revealed that the Blackwood family's roles in the conspiracy extended far beyond their public functions as educators. Cornelius served as the operational commander of the New England region, coordinating activities across multiple institutions and maintaining relationships with corrupt officials who provided protection from investigation. Millicent functioned as the financial administrator, managing the complex systems used to transfer stolen wealth and distribute proceeds among syndicate members. Edmund's responsibilities included the identification and evaluation of potential victims, using his position as an instructor to study student psychology and vulnerability. His mathematical background also made him responsible for calculating the financial value of each potential target and determining the optimal timing for processing operations. Constance's role was perhaps the most sinister of all. As the Academy's music instructor and social coordinator, she was responsible for gathering intelligence about student families, relationships, and personal circumstances. Her musical lessons provided opportunities for intimate conversations that revealed information about family dynamics, financial situations, and the emotional attachments that might motivate intensive investigation if a student disappeared. But Constance's duties extended beyond intelligence gathering. The documents indicated that she was also responsible for the actual execution of many processing operations, using her knowledge of poisons and her access to student living areas to eliminate targets without arousing suspicion. Her feminine appearance and educational background made her above suspicion in the society that could not imagine a well-bred woman capable of systematic murder. The hidden files also revealed the fate of Academy staff members who had become suspicious or uncooperative. Mrs. Henderson was not the first employee to notice discrepancies in student belongings or question the explanations for sudden departures. Previous laundry supervisors, kitchen workers, and groundskeepers who had asked uncomfortable questions had themselves become victims of processing, their deaths attributed to accidents or sudden illnesses that prevented further inquiry. Thomas realized that Mrs. Henderson's preservation of student belongings and her willingness to share information with him had marked her for elimination. The elderly woman's courage in maintaining evidence of the missing students had unknowingly signed her death warrant, and Thomas's investigation had accelerated the timeline for her processing. As Thomas read through document after document, detailing the systematic murder of dozens of young people, he began to understand the true scale of the evil that had consumed Blackwood Academy. This was not a family that had gradually descended into criminality due to financial pressures or personal corruption. The Blackwoods had established their educational institution from the beginning as a cover for organized murder, carefully constructing a facade of respectability while planning the deaths of the students entrusted to their care. The revelation that shook Thomas most profoundly was the discovery of correspondence discussing expansion plans for the syndicate's operations. The success of institutions like Blackwood Academy had encouraged syndicate leaders to establish similar facilities in territories and states where law enforcement was less developed and wealthy families were more isolated from protective relatives. Plans were already underway to establish new processing centers in California, where gold rush prosperity had created numerous wealthy families with children who needed education but lacked local support networks. The syndicate viewed the American frontier as an ideal environment for expanding their operations, with vast distances and limited communication, making it easier to eliminate victims without triggering investigation. Thomas's hands trembled as he realized that his discovery of the Blackwood conspiracy had uncovered something far larger than a single criminal family. He had stumbled upon evidence of a coordinated effort to prey upon the most vulnerable members of America's emerging wealthy class, using society's trust in educational and charitable institutions to facilitate systematic murder on an unprecedented scale. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor outside the headmaster's office sent Thomas into a panic. He quickly photographed the most damaging documents using a small camera that his father had given him as a going-away gift, then carefully returned the files to their hidden compartment. As he attempted to restore the office to its original appearance, Thomas realized that his time for covert investigation had run out. The footsteps belonged to Cornelius Blackwood himself, returning from lunch with the measured stride of a man accustomed to absolute authority. Thomas barely managed to position himself at the visible filing cabinets before the headmaster entered his office, but his hasty movement had left subtle signs of his presence that an observant person might notice. Cornelius's greeting was cordial, but carried undertones that made Thomas's blood run cold. "Ah, Thomas, how dedicated of you to work through the lunch hour. I trust you're finding your administrative duties educational as well as helpful to the Academy's operations." The headmaster's eyes moved systematically around his office as he spoke, taking inventory of every visible detail with the practiced efficiency of someone trained to detect security breaches. When his gaze settled on the desk area where Thomas had been working, his expression shifted almost imperceptibly, suggesting that he had noticed evidence of unauthorized access. "I've been meaning to speak with you about your future here at Blackwood Academy," Cornelius continued, his voice maintaining its artificial warmth while his eyes remained cold and calculating. "Your conscientiousness and attention to detail have impressed the entire faculty. We believe you have the potential for very special recognition before the end of the current academic term." Thomas felt his heart racing as he recognized the coded language that had appeared in the hidden documents. Special recognition was the euphemism used to describe students who had been selected for processing, and the reference to the end of the academic term suggested that his elimination was planned for the near future. "Thank you, sir," Thomas managed to reply, proud that his voice remained steady despite his terror. "I'm honored by your confidence in my abilities." Cornelius's smile was predatory rather than paternal. "Excellence should always be rewarded, Thomas. I believe December will bring some very significant changes to your educational experience here at Blackwood Academy." As Thomas left the headmaster's office under Cornelius's watchful gaze, he realized that his investigation had reached its most dangerous phase. The Blackwood family knew that he had uncovered their secrets, and they were preparing to eliminate him before he could expose their crimes. His only hope for survival lay in finding a way to escape the academy and deliver his evidence to authorities, who were not part of the conspiracy. But with December only weeks away and his movements increasingly monitored, Thomas faced the terrifying possibility that he might become the next victim in a systematic campaign of murder that had already claimed the lives of dozens of innocent young men. The boy who had begun his investigation out of simple curiosity about enrollment numbers now found himself trapped in a nightmare where knowledge meant death and silence meant complicity in ongoing atrocities. Thomas knew his time was running out when he discovered arsenic crystals hidden in his breakfast porridge on a cold November morning. The tiny white granules, barely visible among the oats and cream, would have been undetectable to anyone not specifically looking for signs of poisoning. But Thomas had spent the previous week studying medical texts in the Academy's library, learning to recognize the symptoms and methods of gradual elimination that the Blackwood family employed. The discovery of the poison meant that his processing had already begun. Rather than the quick, violent deaths that some victims suffered, Thomas was being subjected to slow poisoning that would create the appearance of a wasting illness. Over the course of several weeks, he would gradually weaken and sicken until his death could be attributed to consumption or another common ailment that claimed many young people during New England winters. Thomas discreetly disposed of the contaminated porridge while maintaining the facade of eating normally, but he knew that this represented only a temporary reprieve. The Blackwood family would soon notice his continued health and adjust their methods accordingly. His window for escape was closing rapidly, and any attempt to leave the academy would need to happen within days rather than weeks. The boy's desperation led him to make a decision that violated every instinct for caution he had developed during his investigation. Rather than continuing to gather evidence in secret, Thomas chose to confront Mrs. Henderson directly about their mutual danger and propose a coordinated escape plan. The elderly laundry supervisor had shown remarkable courage in preserving evidence of the missing students, and her knowledge of the academy's daily routines made her an invaluable potential ally. Thomas found Mrs. Henderson in the basement laundry facility during the afternoon break between classes, when most students were engaged in recreational activities and the building was relatively quiet. The Irish woman was working alone, as had become her custom since the Blackwood family had dismissed her assistant under mysterious circumstances the previous month. When Thomas explained his discovery of the hidden documents and his realization that both of their lives were in immediate danger, Mrs. Henderson's reaction confirmed his worst fears. The elderly woman had been experiencing her own mysterious health problems over the past week, symptoms that she now recognized as consistent with gradual poisoning. "They've been putting something in my tea," she whispered, her weathered hands shaking as she described sudden bouts of nausea and weakness that had begun appearing without explanation. "I thought it was just the strain of working alone, but now I understand what's happening to me." Mrs. Henderson revealed that her suspicions about the academy had extended far beyond concern about abandoned student belongings. Over her 2 years of employment at Blackwood Academy, she had noticed disturbing patterns in the academy's operations that suggested systematic deception and possible violence. She had observed Edmund Blackwood making frequent nighttime trips to a section of the academy grounds that was supposedly off-limits to all academy personnel. These journeys always occurred during new moon periods when darkness provided maximum concealment, and Edmund always returned carrying a shovel and other tools that suggested excavation activities. More disturbing still were the occasional screams that Mrs. Henderson had heard echoing through the academy's corridors during the late-night hours. These sounds, which came from areas of the building that were supposed to be unoccupied, were quickly explained away by faculty members as the result of student nightmares or minor accidents. But the frequency and intensity of these disturbances suggested something far more sinister than ordinary dormitory disruptions. Mrs. Henderson had also noticed that the academy's consumption of lime and other chemicals used for sanitation purposes far exceeded what would be expected for an educational institution of Blackwood's size. Large quantities of these materials were regularly delivered to the academy and stored in areas that Mrs. Henderson was forbidden to access, despite her responsibilities for general facility maintenance. The elderly woman's most damaging observation concerned the academy's relationship with local authorities. She had witnessed several meetings between Cornelius Blackwood and Hartford County Sheriff William Morrison, meetings that took place in secret and involved the exchange of substantial sums of money. Sheriff Morrison's visits to the academy always occurred after student disappearances, and his cursory investigations invariably concluded that missing students had simply left voluntarily. Thomas realized that Mrs. Henderson's information provided crucial context for understanding how the Blackwood conspiracy had operated for so long without detection. The family had cultivated relationships with corrupt local officials who ensured that any investigations into student disappearances would be perfunctory and inconclusive. This revelation transformed Thomas's escape planning from a simple matter of leaving the academy to a complex problem of evading an entire network of conspirators who controlled local law enforcement. Any attempt to seek help from Hartford authorities would likely result in their immediate return to Blackwood Academy and accelerated processing. Mrs. Henderson proposed an alternative that demonstrated her remarkable courage and resourcefulness. She had maintained correspondence with her nephew Patrick, who worked as a clerk in the Connecticut state capitol in Hartford. Patrick had access to state officials who were not part of the local corruption network, and his position gave him knowledge of which authorities could be trusted with sensitive information. The plan that Thomas and Mrs. Henderson developed was desperately risky but represented their only realistic hope for survival and justice. They would escape from Blackwood Academy during the chaos of the Academy's annual Thanksgiving celebration, when security would be focused on managing visiting families and special events rather than monitoring individual students and staff members. Mrs. Henderson would use her knowledge of the Academy's routines to create a diversion that would allow Thomas to access Cornelius Blackwood's office one final time. During this last infiltration, Thomas would photograph the most damaging evidence from the hidden files and steal original documents that could serve as proof of the conspiracy's existence. While Thomas gathered this evidence, Mrs. Henderson would collect the preserved belongings of missing students that she had hidden in the laundry facility's storage areas. These personal effects would provide tangible proof that the missing boys had not left voluntarily, as their families had been told. The two conspirators would then meet at a predetermined location outside the academy grounds and travel together to Hartford, where Mrs. Henderson's nephew would help them present their evidence to honest state officials who possessed the authority to investigate and prosecute the Blackwood family. The plan required precise timing and flawless execution, as any mistake would result in their immediate capture and certain death. But as Thomas and Mrs. Henderson finalized their preparations, they received an unexpected and devastating setback that threatened to destroy their escape attempt before it could begin. David Richardson, the pale 13-year-old student who had questioned Marcus Hartwell's sudden departure, approached Thomas with information that changed everything they thought they knew about the Academy's security measures. David had been conducting his own secret investigation into the missing students, motivated by genuine friendship with several of the disappeared boys and growing suspicion about the explanations for their departures. David's investigation had led him to discover something that neither Thomas nor Mrs. Henderson had suspected. The Academy was equipped with a sophisticated system of hidden passages and concealed observation points that allowed the Blackwood family to monitor activities throughout the building without being detected. The 13-year-old had stumbled upon these hidden passages while exploring areas of the Academy that were supposedly off-limits to students. His small size had allowed him to squeeze through spaces that would have been inaccessible to adults, leading him to discover a network of concealed corridors that connected every major room in the Academy. From these hidden vantage points, David had witnessed conversations and activities that revealed the true nature of the Blackwood family's operations. He had seen Edmund Blackwood disposing of blood-stained clothing in the Academy's furnace, watched Constance preparing mysterious powders that she added to individual students' food, and observed Cornelius meeting with rough-looking men who arrived at the Academy under cover of darkness. Most importantly for Thomas and Mrs. Henderson's escape planning, David had discovered that their recent conversations in the laundry facility had been overheard by Constance Blackwood, who had been monitoring their activities through concealed listening posts built into the building's structure. This revelation meant that the Blackwood family was already aware of their escape plans and would be prepared to intercept any attempt to flee the Academy. The carefully constructed diversion and evidence-gathering operation that Thomas and Mrs. Henderson had planned would walk directly into a trap that could result in their immediate processing rather than eventual escape. David's information forced a complete reconsideration of their escape strategy, but it also provided them with knowledge that could turn the Blackwood family surveillance system to their advantage. If they could use the hidden passages that David had discovered, they might be able to move through the academy undetected and access areas that the Blackwood family believed were secure. The new plan that emerged from this intelligence was far more ambitious and dangerous than their original scheme. Rather than simply escaping with evidence of the conspiracy, Thomas, Mrs. Henderson, and David would attempt to rescue other students who were scheduled for processing while simultaneously gathering enough proof to expose the entire syndicate network. This expanded mission required them to access not only Cornelius Blackwood's office, but also the restricted areas of the academy where David had observed suspicious activities. They would need to document the physical evidence of murders that had already taken place while preventing additional killings that were planned for the immediate future. The three conspirators spent the remaining days before Thanksgiving finalizing their preparations, using David's knowledge of the hidden passages to conduct reconnaissance missions that mapped out the academy's true layout. What they discovered during these covert explorations exceeded their worst nightmares about the Blackwood family's activities. The restricted areas of the academy contained facilities that had been specifically designed for torture and murder. Soundproof rooms equipped with restraints and medical instruments provided spaces where students could be killed slowly and systematically. Storage areas contained the preserved remains of previous victims, maintained as trophies or insurance against potential blackmail attempts. Most horrifying of all was the discovery of a detailed schedule that outlined the processing timeline. For the remainder of the academic year, Thomas's name appeared at the top of the list, scheduled for completion during the first week of December. Mrs. Henderson was listed for processing immediately after the Thanksgiving holiday, while David, Richardson, and 3 other students were marked for elimination before the Christmas break. The schedule revealed that the Blackwood family had accelerated their timeline in response to the increased surveillance activities they had detected. Rather than spacing out the deaths over several months, they were planning to eliminate all potential witnesses and security risks within a matter of weeks. This compressed timeline meant that Thomas, Mrs. Henderson, and David had only one opportunity to execute their rescue mission. The Thanksgiving celebration would provide their only chance to access the evidence they needed while simultaneously preventing the mass murder that the Blackwood family had planned for the holiday weekend. As the day of their desperate gamble approached, Thomas realized that their success would depend not only on courage and careful planning, but also on their ability to turn the Blackwood family's confidence in their surveillance system into a fatal weakness. The academy that had served as a prison for so many young victims would become the battlefield where justice would finally confront the evil that had consumed Blackwood Academy for far too long. The Thanksgiving rescue mission unfolded with desperate precision as Thomas, Mrs. Henderson, and David executed their plan during the academy's evening celebration. Using the hidden passages David had discovered, they moved through the building like phantoms, gathering photographic evidence of the torture chambers while the Blackwood family entertained visiting parents in the main hall. Thomas's photographs captured the horrific reality of the processing rooms, while Mrs. Henderson collected the preserved belongings that would prove the students' true fates. David's small stature allowed him to access Cornelius Blackwood's safe, retrieving the original syndicate correspondence that detailed the network's full scope across New England. The confrontation came when Constance Blackwood discovered them in her father's office. Her attempt to summon help was silenced by Mrs. Henderson's surprising strength, the elderly woman restraining the younger killer while Thomas completed his evidence collection. Edmund's arrival moments later led to a desperate chase through the academy's corridors, with David's knowledge of the secret passages providing their escape route. Their flight to Hartford proved harrowing as Sheriff Morrison's men pursued them through the Connecticut countryside. Mrs. Henderson's nephew Patrick proved instrumental in their survival, meeting them with fresh horses and guiding them to State Attorney General Harrison Wells, one of the few officials known to be beyond corruption's reach, Wells's investigation moved with unprecedented speed once he examined their evidence. The photographs of torture chambers and the original syndicate. Documents provided irrefutable proof of systematic murder. Within 48 hours, federal marshals had surrounded Blackwood Academy, while simultaneous raids struck syndicate facilities across New England. The Blackwood family's capture revealed the full horror of their operations. Excavation of the Academy grounds uncovered the remains of 43 students, their bodies preserved in lime-filled graves hidden beneath the school's foundation. Cornelius Blackwood's detailed records documented each murder with clinical precision, treating human lives as mere inventory in a grotesque business enterprise. The trials that followed shocked the nation and led to sweeping reforms in educational oversight. Cornelius and Edmund Blackwood received death sentences carried out publicly in Hartford in March 1845. Millicent Blackwood died in prison awaiting trial, while Constance was sentenced to life imprisonment in a Connecticut asylum for the criminally insane. Sheriff Morrison's execution alongside his corrupt deputies sent a clear message that official complicity in such crimes would face the ultimate penalty. The broader syndicate network crumbled as authorities traced the conspiracy's tentacles across multiple states, resulting in dozens of additional arrests and the exposure of similar operations from Boston to Philadelphia. Thomas Whitmore's courage earned him recognition from President Tyler himself, who praised the boy's determination to seek justice despite mortal danger. The financial reward provided by grateful families funded Thomas's education at Hartford College, where he studied law with the intention of protecting vulnerable children from institutional predators. Mrs. Henderson received a commendation from the Connecticut legislature and a pension that ensured her comfortable retirement. She used her remaining years to advocate for stronger oversight of boarding schools and orphanages, her testimony helping pass legislation that required regular inspections and background investigations for educational institutions. David Richardson's quick thinking and bravery were acknowledged with a scholarship that allowed him to pursue his own legal education. He later became a renowned prosecutor specializing in cases involving crimes against children. His childhood trauma transformed into a lifelong commitment to justice. Blackwood Academy itself was demolished in 1846, its grounds consecrated as a memorial cemetery where the recovered victims could finally rest in peace. The memorial's inscription, suggested by Thomas during the dedication ceremony, reads simply, "In memory of innocence lost and justice found. May their voices never be silenced again." The legacy of the Blackwood conspiracy extended far beyond individual prosecutions. The case established precedents for federal jurisdiction over crimes that crossed state boundaries and prompted the creation of standardized reporting requirements for educational institutions receiving students from multiple states. Thomas Whitmore grew up to become one of America's most respected federal prosecutors, specializing in cases involving organized crime and institutional corruption. His methodical approach to investigation and unwavering commitment to truth made him a natural choice for sensitive assignments throughout his career. The boy who had begun counting enrollment discrepancies became a man who ensured that justice counted for everyone, regardless of their age or vulnerability. His personal motto, inscribed on his office wall throughout his distinguished career, served as a reminder of the lessons learned in those dark November days. Vigilance is the price of innocence. Courage is the shield of the defenseless. The Blackwood Academy case remains a watershed moment in American criminal justice, demonstrating that even the most sophisticated conspiracies could be exposed by ordinary people willing to risk everything for truth. Thomas Whitmore's story reminds us that heroes often emerge from the most unlikely circumstances, and that the courage of a few can triumph over the evil of many. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.